So, Chapter 13, Key Issue 4, is about why cities face challenges. We're going to look at the changing urban physical geography. So, the process of deterioration refers to the breakdown of cities, particularly older cities, the older urban areas, and how the buildings become decrepit, how neighborhoods become abandoned, and how areas become less wealthy, you have less services offered, you have businesses closing that are in the area, and then you end up with homes that are subdivided into apartments. We call this filtering. So if you take an older home and you subdivide it into smaller homes or small apartments to rent out, it means that you can rent out the same property to several people and still make more money. As the property value becomes less and less and less, and landlords don't make money because they can't rent the properties out for as much money. They stop maintaining them, and so appliances start to fall apart, paint falls off, carpets are in disrepair, broken windows won't be fixed, water leaks, and so they become unsafe to live. The practice of redlining can also lead to the deterioration of a city. Redlining is when you draw lines on a map to identify areas in which they'll refuse to loan money to purchase or to fix up a house. Redlining is illegal, but it's difficult to enforce because there's not actually, when we say draw lines on a map, they're not hanging the map up. They might say a zip code instead, or they might refer to a neighborhood in which they don't finance homes, or they might say, oh, that neighborhood's out of our service area. You know, another bank is closer, we have a different branch that's closer, so we don't lend money out of our service area. But you're not going to walk into a bank and find in, like the branch manager's office, like a giant map with a line drawn across where they won't lend money. So the idea of drawing a map, it might even just be more of a metaphorical map in this case. Although it would be easier to catch if they did. And then public housing can also lead to the process of deterioration. So during the mid-20th century, the old substandard inner city houses were replaced with public housing. So these old homes were torn down and replaced with public housing. Most of the old homes were really quick, cheap homes that were built for factory workers in the 1800s and during the early 1900s during the Great Migration, like tenement homes. But when they were replaced with low-income housing, this house was reserved for low-income households that had to pay their rent would come from about 30% of their income. The housing authority is established by the local government, and they manage the buildings, and the federal government would pay for all expenses not covered by rent. Public housing is a great idea. We need to make sure people have homes, and no matter, my opinion is that no matter what you think about adults deserving public housing or not, children born to those adults certainly deserve a roof over their head, and they should have a safe place to sleep at night. But I think in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we can certainly find a way to make sure people are sleeping in a home at night. And some public housing, people pay lower rent, and some the rent is completely paid for. But usually people just pay a lower rent. When you have public housing that's integrated into regular neighborhoods, it's a great idea. But in some of the first public housing projects that were built in the U.S. and also in Europe at the same time were built in just whole neighborhoods by themselves. So they weren't integrated into wealthier neighborhoods. They weren't integrated into middle-class neighborhoods. They were just built as giant housing projects. And then that's where the term the projects came from, right? Because this was a public housing project. And so if you grew up in an area with a large housing project, you might have heard somebody say, like, oh, they live in the projects. So in Chicago, where I'm from, the big public housing projects like Cabrini Green and the Robert Taylor homes, they didn't work. They didn't work because it was just one giant neighborhood that all the poor people ended up living in, and the schools were lower quality, and it was harder to find teachers to work there. and unemployment rates were high because businesses weren't opening there. And so it kind of backfired. So the idea that you could build like giant neighborhoods of all this public housing, if you don't have good jobs and good schools, you're really kind of condemning people to a cycle of poverty. And people can get out, of course. There's always a great story, but in general, if you've got thousands of people living in a neighborhood with no jobs and schools that aren't staffed properly and schools that are falling apart, like it's much harder to succeed. So in Chicago, we've torn down the public housing, and they've rehoused everybody throughout the south side of Chicago. A lot of the public housing projects in Chicago have been there since the mid 1900s. So they had well-established gang territories. Not everybody in there is in a gang, obviously, but when they rehoused people, they rehoused them in the south side of Chicago, and they weren't housed according to their neighborhood or their affiliations, because why would you ask people if they were in a gang and what gang they were in before you move them to a new neighborhood? So what you have is an increase in violence in the south side of Chicago now because people who are involved in gang activity are reestablishing territories. And so the increase in gun violence in Chicago really kind of plays back to this public housing crisis and the deterioration of some of our inner cities. Here's some public housing being demolished. So we can change the face of our cities, and there's a process called gentrification. Gentrification is the process by which middle-class people move into a deteriorated inner-city neighborhood, and they start to renovate the housing. Most of our cities have at least one sustainably renovated inner-city neighborhood where middle-class people live. And middle-class families are attracted by some of the following: houses that have more architectural character because they're older. They were built in a different time. They weren't built in the age of McMansion, so they don't all look alike. But you might find some great architecture from the 1800s or the 1900s. They are close to cultural and recreational activities, and the commuting time to the CBD is reduced. So people enjoy moving back into the cities lately. I think that there's a rise of people who are tired of driving, so they like the idea of having public transportation. They like living near theaters and movie theaters and museums, so they don't have to drive to them. And gentrification has positive attributes and it has negative attributes. If gentrification is done in such a way that it betters the life of the people who already live in that community, it improves their work prospects and it improves their housing situations, and they end up, with better schools and an improved quality of life, then gentrification is amazing. I'm sure anyone who lives in a neighborhood that's not safe would like to live in a more safe neighborhood. I guess, unless you're the one doing the crime. But if making the neighborhood safe means that I can't afford to live there with my family anymore, then it doesn't matter if the neighborhood is safe. You've taken my home from me and you've pushed me out. Or if people move into this neighborhood that I've lived in my whole life, and I've just wanted this neighborhood to be safe, and now you look at me like I'm the person that you should be afraid of, then that's not benefiting me either. I've grown up in this neighborhood and it's been my home, and now all of a sudden I must be a criminal because I don't look the same as them, or because I don't have as much money as them. So gentrification is a mixed bag. The public housing projects we were just talking about, Cabrini Green is one of the ones in Chicago, and they were torn down, and they had new condos built. And so where Cabrini Green used to be, they are renting lofts and condos out for $2,500 to $3,500 a month, which is mind-boggling to me, because when I was a kid, people told stories about how an ambulance wouldn't go get you in Cabrini Green if you were shot because they were afraid to drive there. This is a neighborhood that's been gentrified. So if you in New York, a lot of the more artsy neighborhoods in New York have already gone through gentrification. So places like the Village and Soho and even Brooklyn now. Today our art centers have lots of museums and lots of stores and hipster-like restaurants and lots of cool new condos to move into. And so the face of the city has changed. I think the goal is to improve the quality of life for people who live in city neighborhoods that need renovation, but not by pushing them out. And so when it becomes gentrification is when if let's say this woman here moved into a neighborhood and opened a Caribbean themed restaurant, while families that actually have, heritage from the Caribbean are pushed out of their homes, or someone else's traditional restaurant is closed because of this new trendier one. So gentrification usually is bad because it ends up leading to people losing their homes, not getting the opportunities they need, improving the area of the city, but not for the people who originally lived there. But there are good parts to it. So that the goal is to really renovate the city and maybe not use the term gentrification right now because it's had such a negative connotation. But we want to renovate neighborhoods. We want to bring in a variety of different services so it's a stronger economy. And we want to do that without pushing out the people who are there, because we want to improve the lives of the people who live there, right? Like that's what people say when they move into a neighborhood and they try to improve it. And one of the first signs of gentrification is you get like young broke artists moving there because the rent is cheap and they're young, they're single, they don't have kids, and so they might start, selling their art there, and then all of a sudden it catches on. And you've probably seen gentrification here in South Florida. So I think about like Atlantic Avenue and how it looked, how Atlantic Avenue looked when I moved to Florida like 15 years ago, and how I was kind of creeping westward, like the area that like is lit up and has stores and restaurants open at night and stuff. So that's an example of like suburban gentrification. When we look at the social geography, inner city residents are referred to as permanent underclass. So if you have been kind of trapped in a multi-generational cycle of economic poverty, well, I guess all poverty is economic. So this seems to be like this never-ending cycle of economic and social problems. So these are areas that suffer from higher rates of unemployment, alcoholism, drug addiction, illiteracy, juvenile delinquency, and crime. The schools are broken down, and affordable housing is difficult to secure, particularly affordable, safe housing. And things like good learning habits, regular school attendance, completion of homework, these things aren't always addressed, possibly because maybe their parents are working multiple jobs to try to keep a roof over their head, or because their parents didn't finish school themselves, so they don't see the importance, or they never developed those habits themselves, and it's hard to enforce something that you don't really find important. Like if you dropped out of school because you were tired of it when your kid is 16, maybe you're really into them finishing school, or maybe you're just like, yeah, dude, I didn't want to do it either. It's fine. Maybe you're not. Maybe both parents aren't around. But for whatever reason, these good learning habits and the things that are needed to get yourself out of this area aren't always being taught. And they feed each other. So like having whole neighborhoods that suffer from poverty leads to schools that are harder to work in, schools that are falling apart. A lot of our money for schools comes from local property taxes. So if it's not a wealthy area, the school's going to have less money. Teachers aren't going to work there. Teachers might be less willing to work there because students don't have to do homework. They don't have to come to school. So a lot of times teachers quit and move to nicer schools. And so the money leads to the social problems, and not having money leads to, depression or like a sense of like hopelessness, and that can lead to increase in alcoholism and drug addiction. Not being in school or not having parents around, whether they're working hard or they're just not there, leads to an increase in juvenile delinquency. Sometimes alcoholism and drug addiction leads to having children that you can't care for well, and so you're not a great parent in some cases. And so sometimes it's just a cycle, and it's really hard to break. And one of the ways to breaking it is to improve economic opportunity and to improve schools. But it's not something that's going to be fixed overnight. You can't just go in there and fix it. Be like, oh, I put new jobs in here. People aren't working still. Like it's going to take a long time. It took generations to create this problem. It'll take, give us at least one generation to fix it. And so we have to get rid of the culture of poverty. We need to wage war on the culture of poverty, not on poverty itself.